Hey everybody, I have a video here for you today. Surprise, surprise. But sometimes I get ideas for videos just by looking at comments, and I just decide to make one spur of the moment. Some days I can talk intellectually and I have ideas that pop into my mind. Other days I'm brain dead and not a single intelligent thing comes out of my mouth when I try to make a video, so I just quit. But this is one of those days, and I can talk about a bunch of different comments and questions in one video. Now, people have asked me the age of the Sphinx, what do you really think? And I guess that is a developing process, I guess. I mean, it took me a long time to accept the fact that the Sphinx is thousands of years older. And when I first started doing videos, the whole Atlantis thing was kind of a far-fetched thing to me until I researched. And now it is almost just totally acceptable to a lot of people who look into this and realize that ruins go back thousands and thousands of years older or earlier than the accepted standard model of history. And I have been asked, what are your favorite books? And I've talked about Graham Hancock's books, Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, and I also want to mention Sign of the Seal and Heaven's Mirror. Those are two others that I guess I would recommend. But this book here that I'm going to read from, this is John Anthony West, Serpent in the Sky. Anybody who's wondering about Egypt and symbolism and harmonics and proportion and all those things that you hear people talk about, well, this is really the Bible of that symbolism coming from Egypt and stuff that really Egyptologists don't recognize so much. But he talks about Schwaller de Lubitz a lot, and really one line from him in a book that John Anthony West actually translated from French about the erosion on the Sphinx really led to the current alternative history field. So John Anthony West is one we owe a tremendous amount of gratitude. Now I just want to talk a little bit about the Sphinx today. And John Anthony West has a great chapter in his book, and it's called Egypt, the Heir to Atlantis. And he talks about the current standard model of history, and he talks about Schwaller de Lubitz, and that's always a challenge to say, especially from somebody who struggles with pronunciation. But I'm just going to read a little bit here from the book and throw in a few of my own thoughts here. But basically he's talking about an earlier chapter history versus the current standard model of history. It says, a realistic approach to the mystery suggests alternatives that are unacceptable to the orthodox mind. The first is that Egyptian civilization did not develop in situ, but was brought to Egypt by a hypothetical conquerors. This alternative simply translates the mystery of a period of development to the as yet undiscovered homeland of these conquerors. The second alternative is that Egypt did not develop her civilization, but inherited it. It says, the implications of this alternative are obvious. If the coherent, complete, interrelated system of science, religion, art, philosophy of Egypt was not developed by the Egyptians, but inherited and perhaps reformulated and redesigned to suit their needs, that system came from a prior civilization possessing a high order of knowledge. In other words, this alternative brings up the old question of Atlantis. Despite ingenious cultural and philological arguments put forward by supporters of Atlantis, the scholarly consensus at the moment is that the evidence for its existence is circumstantial and inconclusive. But a single remark made by Schwaller de Lubitz takes the Atlantis question out of philology and into geology, where, in principle, verification should pose fewer problems. Goes on to say, Schwaller de Lubitz observed that the severe erosion of the body of the Great Sphinx is due to the action of water, not of wind and sand. If the single fact of the water erosion of the Sphinx could be confirmed, it would itself overthrow all accepted chronologies of the history of civilization. It would force a drastic reevaluation of the assumption of progress. The assumption upon the whole of modern education is based. It would be difficult to find a single simple question with graver implications. The water erosion of the Sphinx is to history what the convertibility of matter into energy is to physics. Now, water erosion versus wind and sand erosion. Almost all geologists agree this is water erosion, and the only geologist that pretty much disagreed with this was the one serving with the Egyptian Antiquity Council. Really, that is the only geologist that disagreed with this. But even if this was sand and wind erosion, which it is clearly not, the big question is, and I think it is important to ask questions, not just to find answers. I think one of the better things about being a researcher is to ask questions that are appropriate. And that really served me well in my shroud research, asking the right questions. But I think the truly right question to ask here, both sides of the erosion theory, is when exactly did this erode? And people have said, how dare you challenge Egyptologists? They are there working in Egypt. They know what they're talking about. You know, you're arrogant to question their views or even, bring up theories that I do. Well, they say 4,500 years is a lot of time for erosion. And the people bringing us history say it's wind and water erosion. But John Anthony West actually has a chapter in his book here that goes over Mark Lehner's theory. And if you read it, it just doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up at all. It kind of contradicts itself compared to what's thrown into the mix also. So I encourage you to read his book, and I'll leave links below. And I got a plane buzzing overhead here, so I'm just going to stop for a second. But the question I ask is, when did this erode? 4,500 years since the time that Egyptologists say the Sphinx was built, and that's the time period they use for their erosion thesis or theory. But John Anthony West brings up an excellent point here in his book, and here are some pictures of the Sphinx. This comes from, I believe, an artist that Napoleon had brought on his trip. And the nose, people have said, well, Napoleon shot off the nose of the Sphinx. But here is a picture of this nose already gone, and Napoleon actually had great respect for the monuments of Egypt, and he really put together the first book, and it's a huge book on all of the monuments of Egypt. So I just wanted to mention that real quick. And I've actually made a video on Napoleon's journey to Egypt. But here is some more pics. But the thing is, the Sphinx, for most of its history, or at least the history that we are aware of, has been totally buried and just the head sticking out. And here is the dream stela, and this comes from Tutmosis IV, who, out of all people, I believe it's him whose face is on the Sphinx. He did restoration on the Sphinx. He built a temple. He totally cleared away all the sand. And I think he put his face on the Sphinx. And in the stela, he has a dream where he talks to the Sphinx. And the Sphinx says, hey, dude, my limbs are in bad shape. They are really eroded. And I need some help here. Basically, that's kind of what the Sphinx says to Tutmosis. And that Tutmosis is from the 18th dynasty, roughly, say, 3,500 years ago. But we know the Sphinx was buried for almost all the time from the 4th dynasty, when they say it was built, to the 18th dynasty. My question is, when did the Sphinx erode? Here is another pic, and I think this is from a couple hundred years ago. And you see here, the Great Pyramid, and just the little head of the Sphinx sticking out. And I believe a Greek historian around 500 BC went, I can't remember who it was, Herodotus maybe, but I believe he went and documented the pyramids of Giza. He did not even mention the Sphinx, probably because just the head was sticking out and it didn't look that amazing maybe from the pyramids, and the Sphinx is really down below the pyramids, maybe not even detected by historians. 2,500 years ago. Now here is a pic from about 100 years ago. I just want to know when the Sphinx did all this erosion, because John Anthony West brings up an excellent point here, and he gives the dates here. Let me get up to that area here. But Khephren from the 4th dynasty, that's who Egyptologists say built the Great Sphinx. Well, shortly after the 4th dynasty, Egypt took a downturn and it went into some turmoil. And we know the Sphinx was buried pretty much up until the time of Thutmose IV in the 18th dynasty. So he gives the years the Sphinx was buried here. And maybe he's a little lenient with these years. So, but he adds it up from the time we know the Sphinx was buried, and it comes to 3,300 years out of the 4,700 years that it is proposed the Sphinx has been around. Those are many years the Sphinx has been buried, and I'd say we chop off 300 years off of this, so let's just say 3,000 years, because I don't think it was buried right after the 4th dynasty. I think probably took a little while. So let's just say 3,000 years. But 3,000 out of the 4,700 years, pretty much it has been buried. In the time of Thutmose IV, 3,500 years ago, the Sphinx is telling Thutmose in the dream stela that his limbs are in bad shape and he's severely eroded. But it was buried almost from the time of the 4th dynasty to the 18th dynasty. I asked the question, when did the Sphinx erode? People have suggested it's 7,000, 8,000 years of erosion. Some people have said 12,000 years. And I put out the theory that it was built around 11,700 years ago. Randall Carlson says the Sphinx appears to have about 20,000 years of erosion on it. Now, do you know where we are right now? We are on a very ancient ramp that led down to a very ancient lake. And I mentioned in my last video that Giza, when it was known as Rostow, a long, long time ago, was an island. And people have left me links to Antoine Giegel's videos, and I have watched those, and I agree with a lot of them, and we have actually talked a lot about the same subjects, so I appreciate those people leaving those links. I think they are excellent. Giza, a long time ago, when it was known as Rostow, let me just back this up here. There was water surrounding it, and it was an island, and the ancient text tells us that. But these ruins in front of the Sphinx, they go down, and research has showed right in front of here, it wasn't an ancient river, it was actually a lagoon, and that pretty much tells me this was an ancient lake out here. The Nile River didn't migrate to the east, it simply dried up. Now that is all speculation. I'm not a geologist, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express one time, and I have listened to Randall Carlson. Now here is the front of the two temples in front of the Sphinx. Ancient text identifies this as the Temple of Tep-2F, the Temple of Anubis, and this place has been buried. And these blocks down here, there's some severe erosion, especially on the inside of the temple. You are not allowed into this temple right here, what is called the Sphinx Temple today. But these blocks have been buried for even longer than the body of the Sphinx. But who was throwing around these up to 200-ton blocks as though they were just Legos? I mean, some of these blocks here are just huge, and they're perfectly stacked, and engineers just scratch their heads today. Now here is the view of those massive blocks from up by the Sphinx, and they are eroded, and good grief. I mean, people today, to move blocks into precision like that, would need a crane, a pretty good crane today on a construction site. Just wanted to mention that. But here are the eroded blocks from the Sphinx Temple, and they have been buried longer than the Sphinx itself. And here today is what we see. The very eroded body of the Sphinx, with restoration blocks coming from the very old kingdom the time that they say, Egyptologists say, the Sphinx was actually built. There are restoration blocks from that time period. So, that makes zero sense to me. The Romans and others did some restoration, but this is very eroded. The face is the least eroded, yet it has been exposed for pretty much all the time we have known about the Sphinx. That makes zero sense. And here is a look at the corner, but here you can see these blocks that have been buried for a long, long time throughout history. But who in the heck builds with limestone and then encases it in perfect granite blocks? And these granite blocks are really almost identical to ones we see in Peru, Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, a place called Timbache, and other places. And I'm sure if you watch Brian Forrester's videos, you're aware of that. But we got some severe erosion out here. These massive blocks that were just stacked up here. Cranes today would have to do that. That is a little look at the Sphinx Temple. When did this erode, if this has all been buried throughout most of history? It led down to an ancient lake. Today it's Cairo. Once again, the entrance into what they call the Valley Temple today. Massive blocks, heavily eroded. And they say these structures were built in the 4th dynasty, but clearly if you read the ancient text and use your common sense, because they were repairing this in the 4th dynasty, this was around a heck of a lot earlier than the 4th dynasty. And I think when I first put out the theory that it was built 11,750 years ago, I thought I was being a little crazy, but the more I look into it, maybe that should be pushed back further into history. When did this erosion take place? If these places were buried for the history that we can account for, it seems to be built in a totally different time period. This was an ancient lake. Graham Hancock has stated that the current standard model of history, the foundations of that are built upon sand. And I can hear it crumbling right now. Hope you thought this was interesting, and you all have a very nice day.